Good morning and a warm welcome to the Farm Business Update Conference 2021. I'm Lewis Bohr and I have the pleasure of chairing today's proceedings. I'm an arable and beef farmer based in the River Ant subcatchment in the Northern Broads of Norfolk, an environmentally important wetland valley with multiple designated sites sitting closely alongside productive agriculture. We have 4 presentations today ranging from carbon management, stewardship choices, post-Brexit BPS, and a route to climate and nature-friendly farming. It's my pleasure to introduce our first guest speaker, Becky Wilson. Becky is Business Development and Technical Director for the Farm Carbon Toolkit. Becky joined the Farm Carbon Toolkit in 2014. Prior to this, Becky worked on the Swarm Hub, a web-based resource management information service dedicated to farmers and growers in the southwest of England. It provides knowledge on best practice and new innovations, demonstrating that sustainable agriculture means more profit for the farming community. Part of the hub's development was the appropriately named CRAP app, a collaboration between the Duchy College and Rothamsted, creating an easy-to-use, accurate and compliant slurry and manure management tool with agronomist connectivity, all based on a mobile telephone. Becky is a passionate advocate for promoting the economic benefits of sustainable farming. Becky currently divides her time between the Farm Carbon Toolkit and the Duchy College, where she works in a rural business school in her role as technical specialist in resource management. In 2016, Becky was awarded a Nuffield Scholarship to further study how to communicate carbon reduction schemes to farmers. An experience I'm sure Becky will be put into good use as she presents our first paper, Why Do We Have to Care About Carbon? Pointers for Your Climate-Friendly Journey. Becky, over to you.
Thank you very much. And it's lovely to be here this morning, albeit virtually, to talk to you about farm carbon this morning. Obviously, we haven't got a huge amount of time, so we're going to have a quick run through some of the areas that we might need to consider. Carbon is everywhere at the moment. Everybody's talking about carbon and how we start to navigate that journey of getting to a point where we can understand our carbon footprint and our environmental impact, but more importantly, start to understand what can we do about it. Next slide, please. So as Lewis said in the introduction, I'm from the Farm Carbon Toolkit. We're a farmer-led organisation set up in 2009, trying to provide practical tools and resources to farmers to try and help understand how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, how that links into farm energy resilience and soil health, and how in doing so you can actually improve your farm business in the future. Next slide, please. So what have we got? Well, the 2 main resources of the organisation are our carbon calculator, which allows you to calculate the carbon balance on your farm. Carbon balance, very simply, is just the areas on the farm where you're producing emissions, so those greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide. And then we take away from that the carbon sequestration and the offsets that are going on the farm. And that gives you your carbon balance. So you have that ability then to be able to calculate where you currently are in terms of your carbon footprint. But the journey doesn't stop there. We then have a toolkit, which then allows you to understand and break down that figure into more manageable chunks and start to understand, well, what does that mean? Is it good? Is it bad? And what are some of those things that you might be able to do to start to reduce emissions and improve sequestration? So those 2 are our sort of, main resources, but we also have a range of special projects. So we run the Soil Farmer of the Year competition, a competition which started in 2016, aimed at really promoting and championing those farmers who are doing fantastic work around sustainable soils management. I'm sure there's lots of you on the conference this morning. So if you would like more information, the competition is open for entries this year. It closes on the 5th of March, so do please get in touch. And then we're also partner in the Soil Carbon Project, which is the largest farmer-led research project at the moment in England looking at soil carbon. And we're very much focusing on how we measure, monitor and manage soil carbon. Next slide, please. So to start off with then, what are we dealing with when we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions? Well, for a lot of other industries, very much they're focusing on carbon, the burning of fossil fuels, which is creating carbon dioxide, which is obviously a greenhouse gas. And very much when we start looking at the language of the topic, it's all focused on carbon. We talk about net zero carbon, we talk about carbon footprinting, we talk about low carbon farming. But as you can hopefully see from that slide up there, carbon is only a very small percentage of what's going on. We actually have 3 gases that we're having to deal with on farm. We have nitrous oxide emissions, methane and carbon dioxide. And hopefully I'm not going to give you a massively doomy gloomy presentation this morning, but my one slight thing that is slightly pessimistic is nitrous oxide. In the fact that nitrous oxide is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. It's 298 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And 80% of nitrous oxide emissions come from agriculture. So we are a main culprit for nitrous oxide emissions. Where do they come from? They come from how we manage our manures, our soils and our fertilizers. So lots of opportunities to start to reduce nitrous oxide emissions and help cut our carbon footprint. But it's certainly something to look at. For us livestock farmers, we then have methane, which obviously, as you know, are much maligned ruminant animals that have been at the focus of a lot of the attention, especially from the media. It's true, our animals or our ruminant animals produce methane as a result of that enteric fermentation as they break down forage and turn it into meat or milk. What's also really important to remember is that methane comes from how we manage, store and apply our manures. So for our non-ruminant livestock farmers, there's still opportunities to reduce methane emissions from how you do your manure management. And then we have carbon dioxide, again, the gas that a lot of other industries are having to deal with, very much from the burning of fossil fuels. So on farm, that's looking at how much diesel and electricity we use, and also from cultivation in terms of how we turn the soil over and expose it to the atmosphere, thus releasing carbon dioxide. But here we also have a unique opportunity in the fact that although we're complicated and we're dealing with 3 gases, we are unique in our ability to provide a climate solution. Farming and forestry are the only 2 enterprises that are able to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and hold it on farm. And that's either through our woody biomass, so what our trees do and our hedgerows, but also for us within agriculture, how we manage our soils. Next slide, please. So why should we manage carbon on the farm? And there's a huge amount of interest both from policy and legislation at the moment. We had the net zero legislation, which came out in June 2019, which superseded the Climate Change Act, which was saying that we had to get those 80% reductions by 2050. Now, the Climate Change Act, which I say came out in 2008, agriculture was under sort of voluntary emissions reductions targets because it was recognised that we were complicated and we were intrinsically linked to food production. But now, with the new net zero legislation, agriculture is very much front and centre within those efforts that we're all having to take cross-sector in terms of being able to reduce our emissions. And obviously net zero mean that the 80% reduction isn't enough anymore. We have to be down at 100%. Or those emissions that we can't get rid of, we actually have to do some offsetting. So there's a lot of reasons as to why we should manage carbon from a policy side of view. Also, if you look more widely than the UK, we've obviously got international targets. We're signed up to the Paris Climate Accord, and obviously the NFU have their target of being at net zero by 2040. But if we very much zoom down and look at, well, why should we manage carbon from a farm perspective? Well, it makes business sense. There's a really, really good relationship between efficient use of resources and reducing our carbon footprint. There are lots of things that we can do that will actually help to build resilience on the farm. It allows us to be more informed and make better decisions. So when we're starting to think what might be some of those things that we might want to change on the farm, we can evaluate those from a carbon perspective as well as a financial and environmental one. It enables a positive narrative, and we really need a positive narrative for our industry now. We have an opportunity through doing carbon management and understanding where we are to be able to change that discussion and really start to champion those things that we are doing on farm that are making a difference. Next slide, please. So that whole process of managing carbon on farms starts by measuring it. And in order to measure your carbon, what you're doing on farm, you have to do a carbon footprint. And identifying the carbon footprint of your business is that first step in being able to quantify the contribution that your farm is making to climate change. And put very, very simply, all a carbon footprint does is it identifies the amount and the source of those 3 different gases, carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, that are emitted from your business, and then highlights areas where you might be able to make improvements or change to reduce them. It highlights current sequestration and offsetting options and allows you to evaluate future projects. As I said in the last slide, it allows you to become more aware and make more informed decisions because you can actually understand where you're starting from. But those metrics that you use need to be relevant, they need to make sense to your business, they need to be consistent, and they need to be that first step in then informing behavioural change. So the process of carbon footprinting shouldn't be so hideous that you have to then go lie down in a darkened room for 3 weeks to get over it. It should be that first step and then be able to say, so what's this information telling me and what can I do differently? Next slide, please. So how do you do it then? Well, you can calculate your carbon footprint. There are various tools that are available. Obviously, this one is our tool, but there are other options that are available to you. There are various different stages. You choose your tool, you log on, you collect your data, you enter that data into your tool, you get your results, and then you decide what to do. Next slide, please. And what's often the case is that a lot of the focus and the attention of carbon footprinting is on the boring bit, is on the bit where you have to put your information in. And we have less attention paid on the bit that's the really exciting bit, even for non-carbon saddos like me. This is the exciting bit, okay? This is when you can start to say, well, where am I now and what can I do about it? Next slide, please. So interpreting results is a really key part of the process. It allows you to understand, so what can I do differently? Gives you a baseline. So it gives you a starting point with your carbon footprint. So, well, this is where I am now, and what might I be able to do in the future to change that? What you can also do is that once you put your data into it, you can then start to look at what if scenarios. So what would be the impact if I changed my fertilizer type? What would be the impact if I changed my cultivation strategy? What would be the option if I started to account for what's going on with soil carbon sequestration? And it can really give you that evidence in terms of changing your management. Thank you. Next slide. But what we currently find, as I say, we've been active and in this space for the last 10 years at Farm Carbon Toolkit. And these are some of the sort of current barriers or the questions that we get thrown at quite often. And one of the big ones is the lack of consistency in how we calculate carbon footprints. Currently, we have specifications that are out there. We have past 2050. However, past 2050, which is the specification from which agricultural carbon footprints, are created, was last updated back in 2012. Obviously, since 2012, research and development has moved on massively, especially over the last few years when there's been that increasing focus on it. As such, we need updated regulation, we need updated guidance as to how these footprints work, because then we can start to have consistency between them. At the moment, the advice is to choose a carbon calculator that works for you and then stick to it. And then that change, when you continue to routinely measure it year on year, you will be able to see difference. We've also got this issue around a lack of clarity in the potential for soil carbon sequestration and the payments that might be associated with it. The degree to which soil carbon is included within carbon accounting systems varies depending on which one you use. And obviously the work that we've been doing with the Soil Carbon Project is providing that vital evidence in terms of the ability of farmers to really provide that climate solution. We've also got some sort of discussions, and again, I'll talk about it more in a minute, in terms of how are we going to finance what's going on with carbon sequestration payments. We've also got a slight lack of policy clarity in the next step. So is it something that we should all get going with now, or should we wait? Because there may well be funding and support to actually help us do this in terms of measuring and monitoring what's going on with carbon footprinting. We've got a lot of simplification of the issue by the media, which can lead to real challenges in overcoming some of those preconceptions with farmers. So all of you guys will have read or watched or got cross with something that's been on the news or in the media about agriculture's environmental impacts. I guarantee you. Okay, so therefore, when we start thinking about how we're going to do things on the farm, we have to then start to unravel that a little bit and see, well, yes, there's all this misinformation out there, but what can I do and how can I play my part? A lot of farmers that may have had carbon footprinting in the past through various different schemes may have had a really bad experience. It can be a pretty miserable thing to go through. So therefore, when we start doing it again, we've got to be able to overcome that. Next slide, please. But there's lots of movement, and we're seeing huge amounts of growth in this area. And where's that growth coming from? Well, it's coming from farmers who want to understand their impact and monitor change. So we've had a 600% increase in the number of farmers that we're working with through the carbon calculator. And a lot of those is farmers who just want to see where am I now and where might I be able to go. We've also seen an increase from farmers who are starting to direct sell to consumers and are wanting their carbon credentials as part of their marketing opportunity. Working with producer organisations who are wanting to sort of differentiate their production system. We're doing a lot of work with supply chains now, helping them understand what's going on beyond the farm gate. So within the farm gate, to add on to what they're currently calculating for beyond farm gate. A lot of work with processors. We have a lot of local communities and local authorities who are starting to declare climate emergencies. So again, and they need to understand what the potential is for farming and their farming sector to play their part in that. And we've also got this emerging area of voluntary offsetting and payments, which is really interesting. Next slide, please. And where is this sort of advent and this massive increase in the interest in farm carbon offsetting coming from? Well, it's coming from an increasing number of organisations which are committing to their net zero targets, both within the retail sector and more widely. And they're understanding that a key part of achieving their net zero targets is actually being able to understand and monitor those natural capital solutions. We also, as I said at the beginning, have the UK government commitment to their net zero ambitions, and how farm carbon storage will play a part in that. We have a growing public awareness about climate change, which leads to an increasing pressure and expectation for action. If you look back to when we had the school strikes for climate, we have the development of Extinction Rebellion, and other groups are really starting to pile the pressure on that the government needs to act on climate change. We have this growing development of natural capital accounting, so that actually we can start to understand the value that our farmland and how we manage it is providing. And alongside that natural capital accounting, we have this increasing recognition and understanding and interest in natural climate solutions. What is the potential for soil carbon sequestration, and how can we reward farmers for doing those management practices that are improving soil carbon, and the opportunities of regenerative agriculture? Next slide, please. Thank you. And this has sort of all been framed within this window of regenerative agriculture. And again, has really come from this idea of these net zero ambitions across major food businesses. And as I said in the previous slide, they're starting to realise that in order to meet their targets, they really have to start to embrace some of these nature-based solutions. And those are really emphasising principles on improving soil health and how they can draw down carbon. Farmers have high expectations for future payments for those verified gains. And there's a lot of work going on in terms of that monitoring and reporting and verification side of this debate. But there are multiple risks and challenges for the marketplace when we look at how voluntary offsetting might work. Next slide, please. So, how might it work? And how is it currently working in terms of payments for gains in farm carbon? Well, despite the fact that there is major interest, there is so much private finance interest in this area at the moment. There are currently quite a few actors who are actually paying farmers for carbon credits, and none of them are currently paying farmers for soil carbon credits. There's about 645 woodland projects which are registered under the Woodland Carbon Code, and there's a few more that are registered under the Peatland Restoration Code. Now, both of those, the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Restoration Code, both have that code word which is common between them. Now, that code word means that there is a set of guidelines and a protocol as to how those schemes are evaluated. And that's the thing that we're currently missing within soil carbon. There are several schemes that are operational or are due to be piloted this year. There's one which has been led by some farmers called Gentle Farming, Soil Capital, which is currently in Europe and has been developed by some agronomists from France and Belgium, where they are currently paying farmers for soil carbon sequestration within, I say, across Europe. And they're very much looking as to how they can come to the UK and start to offer a similar service over here. Indigo Ag, obviously, which has been popular in the States, again, they're looking at how they can start to roll out their service offering to Europe. And there are lots of others who are also starting to be operational in this space. Now, what's really important to remember for some of those schemes is that although soil carbon is one part of it, and there's a level of monitoring and verification that's required there is still that need to actually calculate the carbon footprint of the rest of the business. And sometimes what happens is that actually there's a lot of focus on the soil carbon part, and the sort of rest of the whole farm carbon footprint tends to get slightly overlooked. So it's really important to bring those two pieces together. So those schemes, so Soil Capital, Indigo Ag and others, use a range of different codes, okay, that are sort of applicable worldwide or applicable in Europe. But we don't currently have a soil carbon code here in the UK. But there are a group that are working together to try and develop that code and that sort of framework within which soil carbon payments may well sit. Thank you. Next slide, please. So again, some of those questions that we're quite often getting when we're talking to farmers about this area. Well, what might those barriers be? Well, there are areas around potentially double counting issues. So if we're going to start to build soil carbon, actually, where is that funding going to come from? Is it going to come through ELMS? Is it going to come from private finance arrangements? Could there possibly be the state where actually we could get both of those? So we could potentially get a payment from ELMS for protecting the carbon that we've already got, because it's really important to remember that that carbon has a massive value, and what we don't want to do is let that carbon back up into the atmosphere. And then potentially stack on top of that a payment from a private finance agreement, which actually pays for additional carbon sequestration. Those payments have to be financially significant and attractive. And certainly if any of you have looked at the price of carbon per tonne, it's certainly projected to go one way. But at the moment, as I say, how can we start to stack potentially other payments on top of that is a really interesting point for discussion. When do you participate? So when do you actually get involved into one of these projects? Do you jump now, where potentially lock yourself into a long scheme? Because a lot of these schemes are, you are committed to be included in these schemes for sort of, upwards of 20 years. Is it something that you want to jump into now when the price is at the level it's at, or do you want to wait and see whether that price changes? The technical complexity needs a lot of understanding, and there's a need for that understanding of how we can aggregate this and do this at scale. A lot of the soil carbon projects that have been operational and are working around the world have been done on quite large scale. We have to work out how we can do it here, and we can aggregate those other benefits at the same time. Next slide, please. So to conclude, carbon calculators are a fantastic tool to be able to understand what's going on your farm with carbon management. Back to that point I made at the beginning. If you can't manage carbon on your farm without measuring it, okay? So find one that works for you. What do you want the results for? Do you want the results to be able to understand what's going on with your management, or do you want the results for marketing? Because the tool that you might use would be completely different. But it's also really important to remember it's still an evolving science. We don't have all the answers yet. None of the carbon calculators are perfect. They all have areas to improve, but we have to start somewhere, okay? If we continue to kick this down the road, we're never going to get where we need to get to in terms of limiting global temperature rise and achieving net zero. And also, it's really important to start looking at how you might baseline soil carbon. And again, we have lots of advice and guidance about how to take samples for soil carbon that are coming through from the Soil Carbon Project. And I think, next slide, I think that's it. It is. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Becky. We do have some questions. Excuse me whilst I just turn my head to the side.
That's all right.
How accurate does carbon footprinting need to be? To do it accurately is expensive and technical. What if you're missing key information for your footprints? And that's from Ian Davis.
Okay, so carbon footprinting, in terms of if we look at the sort of the contribution that an individual farm footprint makes to our sort of national target, national reporting and all that sort of thing, they're not massively connected. So for an individual farm to do a carbon footprint, as I said on my last slide, none of them are perfect. We're not there yet, but actually we are quite a long way along that. We're quite nuanced in terms of where they are to date. They all have their assumptions that are made on them. And for an individual farmer, what's really important is to understand what goes into the back of the calculator that you're using, so that they're traceable and open with that information, so that you are better informed as to how those calculations have been made. Because what we don't want to happen is have a sort of black box, as it were, that just spits you out a number that you have no confidence in, and you don't understand how that number's been calculated. And again, as I said at the beginning, it can be quite complicated with dealing with 3 gases. And so when we're looking at some of those mitigation strategies, quite often some of those, there might be ones that are better for one gas and not for another. So we need to have a better understanding. In terms of the level of accuracy, what I tend to say to farmers is, what we want to do is we want to do your carbon footprint and look at the number. Okay, yes, we want to take account of that number. We want to take account of whether it's a positive or a negative number, or how close it is to net zero. Okay, and then we want to look at how that's broken down in terms of carbon footprint per tonne or carbon footprint per hectare or whatever. But what we then want to look at is the change over time, because doing one carbon footprint for 1 year gives you a start, but actually it's not that exciting. What you then want to do is start to continue to monitor year on year, and then you're looking at change. Okay, and again, whether your footprint's going in the right direction or whether it's not. In terms of accuracy, what we also have to remember is that we're dealing with complex biological systems that are inherently dependent on the weather. So we'll have some years where actually you might be producing more nitrous oxide emissions, you know, despite you doing everything right, just because of the conditions that we're in. So what I would say is don't focus inherently on the sort of, you know, 3 decimal places of your carbon footprint. Have a look at whether it's positive, negative. Look at the areas that you might want to change. So breaking down the results into the, you know, percentage where those emissions are coming from, and then start to track it over time. And that change over time is something that's much better to focus on.
Thank you, Becky. I have a question from Ben Crossman. Many have delayed as on agreed set of metrics. Are DEFRA any closer in giving a definitive answer on this? There is a timing issue here as to when to take action and possibility of getting grants to help. Concerns Stewardship, Future Elms or industry schemes. I know you've partially answered this already, but that's from Ben Crossman.
Yeah, perfect. So DEFRA are currently spending a lot of time looking at the carbon calculators and are starting to hopefully come out with a set of guidance. I think what people were thinking about at the beginning was actually we have one calculator that everyone uses. I'm not a fan of having one calculator that everyone uses, even the fact that we've got a carbon calculator, because I think if you end up with just one calculator that everyone uses, you lose that desire and that need to improve them. Okay, if you've got, you know, multiple carbon calculators, then actually, you know, those calculators have to fit farmers' needs and have to do what they, you know, do what you need. But what I think we need that updated, you know, standards that all the tools adhere to, and that's what DEFRA are currently working on. In terms of timelines for when that information is going to come out, I don't know, but all I know is that they are doing it currently because we've just fed into to some of those discussions. How long till the actual report comes out, I have no idea, but we will be ready and waiting to adhere to any updated guidelines as soon as they do.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Becky. We've reached our allotted time of 10 o'clock. We have some more questions, and thank you very much for everyone that's submitted. And I will try to roll them forward to our question and answer session at the end of the morning. So thank you, Becky.
Thank you.
Moving on to our next speaker, Rebecca Inman is a Farmer Environment Advisor at FWAG East. Rebecca has 22 years experience of giving on-farm advice. She's been involved in a number of projects, namely habitat and species conservation and catchment management projects to help improve water quality. Rebecca represents the FWAG Association on both the Championing the Farmed Environment Delivery Group and the Leafmark Technical Advisory Committee. Rebecca's presentation will address stewardship choices for now and the future. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Lewis. Yes, welcome everybody, as Becky said, albeit virtually. I just want to also mention I'm the CFE coordinator for the East of England, so I'm here with my CFE hat on. And CFE, as I'm sure and hope that you all know, Championing the Farm Environment is an industry partnership coming together to share best practice. So that's part of what we're sort of doing today. Next slide, please. So I'm going to really sort of just touch on the sort of changes that have gone on in the last 12 months sort of for stewardship, which is now open for applications, because it's an ever evolving scheme. So it's trying to make the scheme much more attractive, easier to apply for. So there are quite a few changes this year, and that's really what I'm going to sort of just cover. We're going to look at an overview, new for 2021, and I'm going to just do a little recap on the sort of breakdown of how the scheme is. Next slide, please. So this is the sort of broad breakdown of countryside stewardship. We've got at the top the sort of facilitation fund clusters, which are sort of getting a lot more press now. That's something that you can do either through countryside stewardship or independently, cluster groups forming. Higher tier. So higher tier is broken down into sort of woodland elements, restoration and creation of more, I think, probably more specific specialized habitats where you might need a little bit more help in sort of restoring and creating those habitats. And if you have common land. So higher tier sits at the sort of top of that stack. And then we've got mid-tier. Now mid-tier is broken down into two elements, which I'm going to talk about more in a minute, which is the core mid-tier, which includes capital grants and the sort of wildlife offers. And then we've got the capital only, which has seen some changes this year. So previously it was hedgerows and boundaries and water capital grants. And now it's brought together in one sort of capital package where we've got hedgerows and boundaries, water and some woodland elements to it. Next slide, please. So the scheme is now open. So we're now under domestic legislation, so no longer are we falling under EU regulation. Now we've left the EU, so there's a different approach to inspection, and I know inspection is something that has concerned farmers over the years, the way that inspections have taken place. So there's going to be an evolving approach to inspections, and that's something that's being discussed at the moment, but it's going to be an approach more about advisory. Rather than immediate sort of fines and sort of aggressive letters. So it's going to be a different approach to that. There's also extensions being offered, so people who are in existing environmental stewardship agreements are being offered extensions, some of those in higher level scheme who are delivering good environmental work on the ground are being offered agreements, extensions, and countryside stewardship agreements, because obviously people started in 2016 and now coming to the end, and so they're being offered extensions if they want to, or you can reapply if you want to change your options and do something completely different or add to, you can start a new agreement. Educational access has now been brought into mid-tier, so that's a real bonus. So people who had higher level schemes and were doing educational access can now go into mid-tier with that. And as I said, there's this new capital grants offer, which I'm going to talk about in a little while. So timing of applications is quite important because some of them aren't that far away. So if you're applying for capital only grants, that's the end of April. The higher tier is the end of May, and the mid tier is the 30th of July. Now that's crucial because normally it's the 31st of July, the end of the month. But this year, have it in your head, it's the 30th of July because that's a Friday. So it's not the end of the month. So just remember that when you're doing a last minute application, you haven't got the Saturday to fill that in and send it in. Next slide, please. OK, so here it is. This is the manual for 2022 agreement. So this is the Bible for anybody who's going into countryside stewardship this year. It's a very important document. It's 160 odd pages, and I know that sounds fairly meaty, but it's got some really important and useful information in it. It's available online in bite-sized headings, so you can just look and dip in on the .gov.uk website as to what bits you want to read. You don't have to sort of plough through the whole thing in one go. Now, this is where you've got to stay with me because this is where it breaks down a little bit into something a little bit complicated. So just as a recap, countryside stewardship is broken down into core mid-tier and the wildlife offers. And I'm just going to try and explain briefly what that means. So the core mid-tier is the competitive element of the scheme. It's 5 years. It's a whole range of options, which includes management options and the capital item options that you would do over the 2-year period of that scheme. It includes water quality items, organic conversion and sort of support payments. And there are some options in there that do need natural England or catchment sensitive farming agreement. So that's got that part of it. The wildlife offers are where you've got a simplified version of countryside stewardship, and these are sort of evolving, adding more options into it year on year as this scheme evolves. So there are 4 wildlife offers available. So that's arable, lowland grazing, mixed farming and upland. Okay, so those management options are just management options. There are no capital grants within that. So if you're not looking to do any capital grants within the scheme, you can go for the wildlife offers. You can then, in addition, now this is where it gets a little bit complicated, but stay with me, you can do a standalone capital grant alongside your wildlife offer. So you can run the 2 side by side. Okay. You can't do a wildlife offer if you have a site of special scientific interest on your farm, but you can now do an offer if you've got a scheduled monument on your farm. Previously you couldn't. It's non-competitive, so this is the attraction of the scheme. More options have been put into these wildlife offers, so they are becoming more attractive. So the non-competitive element, but you have to meet an eligibility requirement. So there's sort of minimum areas, and it's basically you choose options from the categories listed. So there's generally sort of 3 categories, and you're looking to provide habitat for pollinators, birds and other wildlife, and delivering sort of nesting habitat, overwintering habitat and sort of feeding habitat. So you're trying to sort of maximise the delivery of biodiversity gain within those offers. But the attraction is the non-competitive element of that. So that's how it sort of breaks down into those 2 elements. Okay. So next slide, please. So you are looking really to put the right quality at the right scale and in the right place. And so you're looking to increase farmland biodiversity across the sort of the farmed environment. So as sort of Becky talked about with climate solutions, farmers being the sort of able to, to really deliver on climate solutions, farmers are really able to deliver on biodiversity solutions as well. And it's really important, to use these schemes to help deliver that, so that there's the funding in place for you to, to help deliver those enhancements on your farm. So look at what you've got, enhance the existing habitats that you've got through the positive management, and you can enhance existing areas and create new areas within this scheme, and help sort of deliver the biodiversity benefits and make your farm more resilient to all the sort of climate issues and biodiversity issues that are affecting us at the moment. Excuse me. There's lots of useful guidance on the .gov website. So there's plenty of information and guidance out there that you can look into. I know it's not in a sort of in a handy printed book, and that's quite nice to have, but there is an awful lot out there on the .gov website that you can just trawl through at your leisure when you've got sort of time. There's a wide range of options. So next slide, please. We've got a sort of simplification of applying as well. The wonderful thing about this scheme is that you can apply online. So here we have just the BPS page. So you go onto your BPS portal, and this is what will come up when you log on onto the countryside stewardship element of the BPS portal. And as you can see here, that everything's available at the moment because none of the closing dates have passed. So we've got the option to apply for arable offer, the lowland offers and all the other offers, capital grants, the woodland management plans, a core mid-tier pack, which is the first blue button on there, higher tier. So you just click this and it will then download you a pack, and it will then produce it that you can then open, and it will also email you the document, so you can look at it at your leisure and then see what you've got to do to fill it in. So it's really evolving into a sort of an online scheme that that's quite easy to log on to and to download. And it's the same with the capital. When you're actually the claims, when you're actually looking to claim, this is how you would log on, and you would just download a claim form, fill it in, and ping it off. So it's really becoming administratively simplified to help farmers to apply for the scheme, which is great. Okay, next slides, please. So there's a whole range of options to choose from within countryside stewardship, mid-tier, and the wildlife offers. Now, we've got bird mixes, hedgerow management, creating sort of wildflower areas of all sort of different kinds. You can have pollen and nectar mixes. You can have it in strips and blocks. You can have buffering of watercourses, protecting watercourses, 6-metre margins. You can go up to sort of 12, 24-metre margins and beyond, depending on the criteria of that particular watercourse, whether the land is at risk of erosion or not. You've got grassland options, and then you've got the capital options, sort of hedge planting. There's lots of hedgerow options, planting, coppicing, laying, or just the management. Obviously, we've got the water quality options, spray filling areas, biofilters, rainwater harvesting. There's a plethora of options out there because, as we all know, every farm is different and every farm is going to require different options to suit their business and their farming. So apart from the manual, which I showed you, there's also the options document, which shows you all the available different options and the requirements that there are really to fulfill those obligations. So it's a case of just looking through those and deciding what suits your farm and where, and looking for, maximising the different options that you've got to benefit your farming as well as the environment and the biodiversity. So next slide, please. So the capital grants, which is the new element of it, the sort of standalone capital grant scheme, which was really a sort of hedgerow and boundary grant scheme and water qualities, is now including air quality. And the maximum available grant has increased. So originally for each standalone grant, it was £10,000, and that's now gone up to £20,000. And now included in there is the air quality. So that sort of ties in nicely what Becky was talking about. We're looking at air quality as well. So you can use these capital grants to help you start to deliver on that. Now, it's really important that you've got several closing dates going on here with the mid-tier, and you've got the capital grants. So you've just got to be aware that the closing dates for this is the 30th of April, so the end of April, which is not actually very far away. We've now got, instead of the original sort of 12 options that you had for the hedgerow and boundaries, we've got now 67 standalone capital items within these three groups. So there's a lot there for you to choose from. So you can look at doing a boundary and tree grant. You can also do a water capital grant, and you can do an air quality grant in the same year. So there's £60,000 there available, but only obviously £20,000 for each individual one of those groupings. So that's something new, and that's something that's quite exciting. And in the boundaries and tree grant, we've also got now, finally, we've got hedge planting. So it's not just about coppicing and laying. There's also hedge planting in there as well. So that's something really worth looking at. But just remember the end of April deadline date. Next slide, please. So now we move on to the sort of catchment sensitive farming part of those capital grants, which has been around for quite a long time. So you can either do this as part of a core mid-tier package, and you can have up to £120,000 worth of grant aid within the core mid package, or you can do it as a standalone capital package where you've got your £20,000 maximum limit. Only in priority water quality areas. So that's where you have to go onto Magic Maps, which is a great tool to look at priorities and what you should be looking to deliver under stewardship. And that will show you whether you're in a high priority water quality area and why you're in a high priority water quality area, whether it's for phosphates or pesticides. So that's really important that you look at that, and you get looking at that soon if you're interested in catchment sensitive farming grants. Contact your local catchment sensitive farming officer as soon as possible. You can go onto the .gov website, the .gov website, to look at who your catchment sensitive farming officer is, and then get in contact with them early and tell them what you're thinking and where you are and what sort of things you're thinking about. And you need to do that 6 weeks before you submit a capital grant. You need to make contact with them early. So that's 6 weeks before the end of April, and ideally by the end of May for the core mid-tier. Obviously, with being able to not go outside, it's putting pressure on the CSFOs, the officers going out. So you need to really get in contact with them quickly. There's a form online, so you need to look at the form online and fill that in and tell them what you're thinking about doing, whether it's for spray filling areas, what's the issue, where you are, what would be the problem if you had a spill. So you've got to look at what the issues are and what you can use under mid-tier to identify those. Okay, next slide, please. Applications are prioritised. So what's going to be the pollutant? Where's it going to end up? Is it going to be sediment? Is it going to be ammonia? Is it going to be pesticide? What are the risks? Where are the risks? What are the pathways? So you've got to look at maximising the environmental gain by reducing pollution with the options available to you. Okay, next slide, please. And these are the 4 new grants looking at particularly ammonia. So tree planting is looking at trying to capture ammonia from the air, and then you've got a couple of other grants there to look for livestock reduction of ammonia. Okay, so they're new. Next slide, please. Facilitation fund, I touched on that. That's available in Countryside Stewardship this year. So if you've got a group of farmers you want to bring together and you're looking to work together, then that's something that you can consider under Countryside Stewardship this year, or there's other ways obviously of doing it without coming in under the grant scheme. Next slide, please. Very quickly, I just want to say, that the transition period, which Richard's going to talk about later, is looking at reduction of BPS. Countryside Stewardship is continuing to be improved. So we've got agreements being offered up until 2024. Do not wait. This is going to put you in a good position for ELM, for the Environmental Land Management Scheme. Okay, so the plan is the transition next 3 years. So we've got ELS, the Environmental Land Management System, which you've got 3 components of: sustainable farming incentive, local nature recovery, landscape recovery. So that's part of the Environmental Land Management System. Next slide, please. So why should you not wait? You've got to get in now. You will have the advantage. There's going to be a flight path, a smooth transition between Countryside Stewardship and the Environmental Land Management Scheme. It's a co-design scheme with farmers. You'll be at no disadvantage. You will be at an advantage if you start now. Okay, so it's really worth looking at Countryside Stewardship. Okay, next slide, please. So yes, time and tide wait for no man. We need to deliver the biological benefits. Biodiversity is in crisis. We know that. We're being told about it. So we need to really get on and get into these schemes and show the Treasury that we're interested in these schemes. So use the scheme to help you and your farm business make it more resilient and get involved. Okay, so and look at the CFE website, because there's lots of literature there available for you. Okay, so my time is up. So I think I need to stop there. Next slide. There, so lots of guidance and training available.
Thank you, Rebecca. We've got lots of questions, and thank you very much for everyone submitting them. We'll start with one from Guy Waker. If applying for a mid-tier application with capital elements, is the deadline for the capital April or July?
If you're applying within the core mid-tier, it all comes in under one package, and so you're applying for the end of July. It's okay. The standalone grants that's the end of April. So if you're doing it separately.
Okay. A question from Thomas Pearson. Can you apply for capital only grants if you're still in HLS ELS scheme And are you allowed to seek private biodiversity offset payments if we sign up to a mid-tier scheme?
You can do the standalone capital grants if you are in HLS. So yes, that's new. And you can do them if you're taking up a wildlife offer as well. We're not looking at any funding that's already been funding by something else. So the mantra really with these schemes is so long as there's not other sources of funding to fund the same thing, then that's okay.
Okay. From Edward Bailey, can you take advantage of any of the new options if you've got time left on your current scheme?
Unfortunately not. If you're tied into an existing scheme, you are, unless obviously you're in an HLS and you can do the standalone, but if you're in a standard core mid-tier, then you need to run the course of that scheme before you can apply for anything else. Okay.
And finally, you've said that the mid-tier is the 5-year block as the old ELS. Is a wildlife offer an individual year option or a longer term commitment? And can they be run at the same time? And that's from Sean Palmer.
The wildlife offer is for 5 years as well. So all mid-tier is for 5 years. There's the odd anomaly in higher tier where it might be for 10 years, but all mid-tier options are for 5 years. Yeah. So what was the second part of that question, Lewis?
Let me just have a look. Is the wildlife offer an individual year option or longer term commitment, and can they run at the same time?
On different parcels of land, yes. So you can't have the same parcels of land in an agreement. So long as they're separate, yes, you can.
Okay. Well, we'll leave questions there. Thank you everyone for submitting questions. We've got far too many for the time we've got, but thank you very much. I'd just like to repeat with regards to Neroso and basis points, the details for registering for those will be shown at the end of the conference. It'll be the final slide on the screen. We now move on to our third speaker, which is Richard Wordsworth, NFU's Senior BPS Advisor. Richard has been with the NFU for over 19 years, prior to which he worked in East Anglia as a farm management consultant. Richard has dealt with support schemes since the days of Ajax. His experience has covered a wide range of matters from individual claim queries, implementation issues, drafting guidance, to raising concerns directly with ministers. His knowledge has helped with his current work on BPS and also other schemes such as the Productivity Grant Scheme, and more recently the challenges that lay ahead with DEFRA's Agricultural Transitional Plan, elements of which Richard will touch upon today. Richard was brought up in Northamptonshire, is from a farming family that is scattered across the southern counties. Richard will now address post-Brexit BPS and cross-compliance updates. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Lewis, and good morning, everybody. I'm just going to quickly run through this morning cross-compliance and BPS update. If we could go to this next slide, please. So the focus this morning isn't necessarily on too much into the future. It's on some elements that you need to be aware of for this year. But obviously, just to be aware that the DEFRA did produce a number of documents back at the end of November last year, to be aware of where some of this information comes from, and where Rebecca's also been alluding to with some of her points. So we've got the Path to Sustainable Farming and Agricultural Transition Plan 21 to 24 document, 66 pages, launch, which gives a bit more of the vision of what's coming down the track for the farming sector. Hopefully you would have seen the document here on the right called Farming is Changing. That is the one that is that you should have had from the RPA or DEFRA before Christmas, which again gives a bit of an overview of some of the elements that are going to change in the coming years. Next slide, please. But today we're just going to focus on a couple of those elements. The first one of these is cross-compliance. Cross-compliance still continues to be a feature of schemes, even though we have left the EU in many ways. Cross-compliance is still integral to the running of a number of schemes that we have at the moment, primarily basic payment scheme, countryside stewardship and higher level schemes. So we will see cross-compliance inspections continuing until cross-compliance disappears in its current form. Now for 2021, we aren't seeing any changes to the rules, but what we are seeing is some changes to some of the approaches to cross-compliance this year. So first up, we are seeing a slightly different approach to the proportional nature of penalties. If somebody is found to be in breach, obviously they need to have an inspection first. That's likely to lead to possibly some more warning letters being issued than a financial sanction. To help sort of instigate that, the RPA has changed its verifiable standards on a number of the standards of SMRs and GIACs that sit in cross-compliance to accommodate that change in view. But I think that one of the important things just to mention here is that what I've just mentioned about the proportional nature of penalties and so forth only applies to domestically funded schemes. So that is BPS 2021 onwards, or any countryside stewardship agreement or other scheme that is domestically funded and starts from the 1st of January 2021 onwards. So we will have, for a period of time until probably things get sorted out, a slightly different approach between two comparable farmers who have an inspection. One might get a slightly different sanction to another one. So the key thing here is that a UK finance cross-compliance relevant scheme needs to be will be following those UK slightly more relaxed proportionate penalty regime rules. If you've still got a countryside stewardship or a HLS agreement that's been running before 1st of January this year, you'll effectively still be diverting back to a 3% cross-compliance penalty. So something just to watch out. Hopefully you don't go anywhere near there, but just to be aware that the changes aren't quite as consistent as they may seem. Now, Rebecca picked up on the point about inspections, and inspections obviously still continue whilst public money is still being distributed to private individuals. The approach to inspections is again taking a slightly different slant going forward. It's first of all, they're looking slightly more in the risk-based targeting of those inspections. From an NFU point of view, obviously what we don't want there is a witch hunt and a real prioritising on either geographical areas or specific parts of the sectors of our industry. But what inspectors will be doing is they'll be having a conversation with the farmer if they are inspected for cross-compliance and discussing with them their approach, their attitude, their ethos towards cross-compliance, because that will have some bearing going forward into potentially what the outcome of inspection would be if there's a breach in place. So I suppose what I'm saying here is buyer beware a little bit. Just be careful what you do say to an inspector if they do come onto the farm, because what you say may be taken in evidence and possibly replayed to you at a later point. So the emphasis is changing. We just need to understand that. That's by and large everything on cross-compliance this year. The standards are very similar. What I would say finally is that the handbook has got thinner. That doesn't mean the rules have disappeared. A lot of those rules are now on gov.uk pages. They have stripped out duplication, but the concern there is that people don't follow through that full set of rules, which most of it now sits on gov.uk. Next slide, please. So looking now at BPS for this year, obviously we have BPS for a number of years coming forward, and we'll touch upon that shortly. But BPS, largely the rules and the calendar are similar to previous years. The critical thing that we're still not fully seeing or appreciating is the continuing challenge of COVID-19. If we roll back some 12 months from now, just as the application window opened for BPS and indeed CS and HLS annual revenue claims, so the COVID restrictions started to be introduced, and that obviously had an impact on timings of applications and approaches that the RPA took. So we just need to keep an eye on that, and I'll cover that later on. Claim window, that actually now opens on the 18th of March. I did these slides before the RPA published its timeline key dates document earlier this week. In terms of BPS simplifications, as we know, last year we had a derogation from the free crop rule or crop diversification. In July last year, the government further confirmed that all the greening requirements or associated rules would be removed from the 2021 scheme year. So that's obviously crop diversification, ecological focus areas and permanent grassland. But just on the permanent grassland, just to be aware of, is that the underlying rules around the protection of permanent grassland still remain. So we still have Nutra 2000 sites, we still have EIA regulations as well. We will also still need to this year, when the form application window opens and claim window opens, to still have to code our land as we have done in the past. And that's quite critical when you're cross-referencing with any agri-environmental scheme options on land, that we don't cause ourselves a problem. For example, putting down an arable code where there should be permanent grassland in situ. Further on, entitlement usage rule has been removed. So effectively you don't need to use all of your entitlements this year. You don't need to follow the use it or lose it rule on every 2 years claiming on all of your entitlements. Hopefully nobody gets into this next point. Force majeure, the period in which you have to notify the RPA of a force majeure event has been extended from 15 days to 8 weeks, which obviously is welcome. But coming then back to the application claim window this year, supporting documents can now be submitted up to the 11th of June. The 11th of June is the deadline after the May deadline to get final documents in and submissions made. And just to say that the claim window deadline this year is the 17th of May. Rebecca referred to the weekend influencing on deadlines. The 17th of May is a Monday, the 15th of May is a Saturday this year. Now that's quite critical to remember that, because obviously last year we had obviously an extension of the claim window because of COVID, which was extended to the 15th of June. Please make sure that you revert back to custom and practice of the mid-May date. Late amendments to claims can also be made without penalty, providing the claim went in by the 17th of May. If you can put the, if you have to make an amendment, then that's the 11th of June. Finally, again, inspections. Again, we are expecting probably some slightly different approaches to inspections this year. Obviously, we don't have any greening inspections, but obviously we just need to be aware of inspections still taking place. And finally, there's obviously the progressive reductions in BPS payments starting this year, but we'll come back to that shortly. Next slide, please. So just a few other reminders here about the impending claim window coming up. We've referred to here the COVID-19 challenges that are faced by the RPA, who've been working from home since the middle of March last year, like many of us. Inspections, how to submit forms, how to email the RPA, COVID-19 page, all very important things to just get yourself back up to speed on if you haven't looked at RPA admin and claim form issues for a few months now. There won't be any drop-in centres again this year. The RPA have confirmed that. What we are doing at the NFU is trying to seek clarity on some of the admin processes that were introduced last year for COVID-19 to basically say, are they still continuing this year? And we hope that many of them will do, because they certainly gave a lot of flexibility and pragmatism to the situation. In terms of the online system, again, as Rebecca has alluded, there are some elements there which are new changes to the Rural Payments Online Service. The biggest one that you will see if you haven't been on for many months is that the business overview page has changed its structure and changed its appearance out on there. And also, if you haven't been on for some time, and if you are using a personal email address that is also shared with somebody else's personal records, then you're going to be asked to change. One of you is going to need to change your email address to make sure that the security and understanding of the relationship between the claimant and the RPA is understood. Many of these points were covered in a winter mailer that came out just before Christmas as well. Always useful to dig that email out if you've had it. It's available on RPA website. The RPA are also in the process of putting another mailer together, which hopefully will be out probably April time, which will give some more salient points and cover some of the things we talked about today. And from an NFU perspective, we are planning a number of BPS 2021 claim webinars in March, April time this year. So watch out for that, NFU members on the call. Next slide, please. So just going back to the reductions in BPS, or the progressive reductions as it's called. as has been bandied around for a couple of years now, there is the suggestion that payments are going to reduce, and that was obviously confirmed back in November. What was confirmed at the end of November was not only the cuts for 2021 scheme year, but also those through to 2024. The reason it doesn't go beyond 2024 is because that's the extent of the current government's effective powers to determine policy and detail within that policy. So what this slide shows in the table is the way that cuts will be made to claims based on where they fall in terms of value, and it works very much along the lines of income tax. So the core element for this year is 5% cut if you have any value over 5%, and then that value over the 5% 30,000 threshold will attract a 10% cut, and so on and so forth, both between years and between years and within years. The key thing is BPS will still operate until 2023, so therefore your claim can go up and down from year to year, so you can't necessarily predict what the cuts or the residual payment will be in later years if your claim is going to increase or decrease. When we get to 2024, we fall into something called de-linked payments, which we'll talk about shortly. But hopefully that's a reasonably clear understanding of what is coming down the tracks. Next slide, please. So what is happening after 2021 to BPS? There's a number of things that are happening. As we've already talked to, the first thing is that the value of those payments is reducing down and money is being recycled around other activity within the agricultural transition plan. For example, the ELM, environmental land management that Rebecca referred to, as well as other productivity schemes, slurry, new entrants, farm resilience and so forth. But in terms of direct payments, which is the technical term for what BPS is simply the delivery model. There are a couple of ways that direct payments is going to change in the coming years. The first thing in next year is that there's going to be opportunity for some to take up a one-off lump sum exit payment. What that essentially will mean is that people will receive in one lump sum all their future residual direct payments, whether that's BPS or a de-linked payment, in one lump sum in 2022. But the understanding at that point is that they need to exit the industry. Clearly, what we need to understand is what exit actually does mean, and equally other things such as what the tax treatment will be for those lump sum payments. Will there be a cap on the payment that is issued, and so on and so forth. De-linking, slightly more nuanced, I suppose, in a way, but de-linking is where we're actually de-linking the payments that people will receive, and this will happen from 2024 onwards. This will happen to everybody. The lump sum is an optional payment or approach to payments for some. The de-linking is essentially de-linking from the current process. The current process is entitlements, annual claim form, having to farm land, fill out claim forms, and all the things that you got used to up until the 15th of May each year. So de-linking essentially would mean likely that you will simply receive a lump of money for the remaining years that direct payments will run to, which is until 2027. Clearly, there has to be a process to get from BPS to de-linked payments, and so DEFRA and the government are thinking and looking at a reference period from BPS to take value across into becoming the basis of a de-linked payment value. And then that value is obviously cut down year on year as we reduce direct payments to zero. Now, quite a bit in there. It's probably not as straightforward as perhaps people first seem, both the lump sum or the de-linking. We hope to see some more information around this, some more rationale, some more information coming out when DEFRA publish a formal consultation, which is now planned for March. And we're not quite sure when in March this is going to happen. We've been waiting for this for 18 months or so. But essentially, they are going to consult on a number of perhaps options or perhaps questions of how they should actually do the lump sum, or how they should perhaps what reference year they may use from a BPS time into a de-linked payment. So more details of that to come down the line. For NFU members, we've got a number of briefings online covering the reductions of BPS, lump sums and de-linked payments. So hopefully that will give you a useful understanding of where we are before that consultation comes along the line. And I think from memory that might be my last slide, but if not, I apologise.
Oh, thank you, Richard. A lot of content there. We have some questions from Jack Walpole. If I extend a higher tier agreement into an additional year, does that additional year continue on the old EU sanction regime? And could it lead to backdated liability over the life of the whole agreement?
That's a very good question. My understanding is yes, because yes, as Rebecca alluded to, there are roll forwards of HLS agreements and countryside stewardships that have come to an end of their respective 10 and 5 year terms. And the general understanding is when you roll forward an agreement that's been going for 10 years for the 11th year, you're rolling everything forward, you know, warts and all. So that is both obviously the payment rates, the options that you've taken, as well as the risk of sanctions being backdated to year one, bearing in mind, you know, the 10-year agreement, you're adding on another year, that is 11 years. The primary reason for that, as I understand it, is that is obviously based on the EU rules being rolled forward. And before we got to the current situation of domestically funded payments, we've had roll forward of HLSs and countryside stewardships whilst we were in EU transition. So that was something that was approved by the EU.
Thank you. Question from Katie. Is greening payment rolled into the main payment now, or is that additional money lost?
Very good question, and I probably should have covered it in my presentation. So, Katie, yes, the greening element, the circa 30% as it was described when it first was introduced, that 30% value will be rolled into the BPS entitlement value, and that will then be shown when you get paid in 2021 on your claim statement as an inflated BPS entitlement value. There won't be a line for greening, so you won't lose out. And just to say on the back of that, that the general funding level for BPS 2021 is very similar to 2020 and indeed 2019. So we shouldn't see a great deal of change in people's payment levels if we didn't have progressive reductions, because actually we've got the fixed amount of money. We aren't losing entitlements. And so we may see an odd penny difference on the entitlements, but obviously the big thing that will affect the overall value of the payment for 2021 onwards are those progressive reductions starting to come in.
Thank you. With BPS cuts, if your reduction takes you below a threshold barrier, do you then recalculate based on new payment, or is it based on the starting point? And that's from Guy Wakeham.
Thank you, Guy. So the way it is being described to us is that the RPA will construct your claim, will recognise the fields, recognise the entitlements available, determine the gross value of the claim. So that will be what you know, X number of entitlements by a value. They will then apply any penalties or reductions that need to be made, such as a claim going in late or a late amendment, sorry, not a late amendment, you know, cross compliance penalty or something like that. That will then lead to a residual value. That value will then be effectively pushed into the sausage machine, and whichever components of that that value will then be will effectively have the cuts applied to them. So if you're £45,000, you know, the first 30,000 will be a 5% cut, the next 15,000 will be at the 10% cut.
Okay, thank you, Richard. And finally, from Carl Atkin, Richard, I've heard various figures bandied about for the cap on a lump sum payment and the eligibility rules. Can you shed any more light on this, and when is DEFRA planning to formally consult?
Thank you, Carl. So as I said, the consultation is due in March. That has been confirmed now by the programme director, Janet Hughes, in a blog recently. We're not quite sure exactly what day in March that will be. My concern there is, of course, it's going to land just as the claim window opens for BPS 2021 and could confuse people when we don't want any more problems than we normally see with BPS applications. We are told that that will cover information about whether there is a cap. It will tell us a bit more rationale. It will tell us potentially who may be eligible, the sorts of people they may be sort of looking at. They will try and try and clarify what exit means. So do I have to sell my farm? Could I, tender out my farm on a long-term tenancy, let's say minimum of 5 years? Could I still live in the farmhouse with perhaps a small acreage around there, but effectively retire? Could I even use this this opportunity to essentially surrender a tenancy or even pass tenancy on between generations? I mean, the key thing here is the underlying policy here is that our government would like to see opportunities being created, possibly help people decide to exit the industry. From an NFU point of view, this is all fine and good. We see that the exit lump sum is rather crude, and it should be part of a wider range of package for farmers. So that if they do decide this is the time to exit the industry, they do with dignity and on that side.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Richard. Very informative, and thank you for fielding the questions. We'll now move on. Just to show that we are truly interactive today, from Rebecca's presentation earlier, Simon Evans has just sent in that to be aware that there is also a deadline for the Stewardship online packs. So that's just a little bit of an update from Simon. We now move on to our final presentation of the day and our second guest speaker, which is John Posey. John's family have farmed in Suffolk for 4 generations, and John started farming at Lavenham Lodge Farm with his grandfather and now farms at Shimpling Park Farm. John's more recent journey began in 1999 when he commenced the organic conversion of his 650-hectare farm, following concerns of overworked soils and diminishing biodiversity. John now farms entirely organically and also contract farms an additional 915 hectares for like-minded neighbours, growing wheat, barley, oats, beans and spelt. John sees his challenge as a use of modern technology to control weeds, pests and diseases without the use of pesticides, whilst building soil fertility naturally. He aims to have a positive effect on biodiversity and to operate as a carbon negative farm. Further to today's presentation, John's progress can be monitored by reading his Farmer Focus contribution in the Farmers Weekly. John's paper is titled Pathways to Profitable Soil, Nature and Climate Friendly Farming. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's quite a challenge, pathways to profitable soil, nature and climate friendly farming. And to add that challenge, I've been asked 3 questions. And the first question is how does our way of farming make a profitable soil? The second one is how does this affect nature on the farm? And the third one is how are we making climate friendly decisions? Can we have the next slide, please? So the first question, how does our way of farming make profitable soil? Next slide. So personally, I believe that the reintroduction of lays and animals are key to the long-term profitability of our soils. And that's one of the reasons why we introduced sheep onto our farm in 2015 and now run a rotation with a 2 to 3 year lays. And that's the regenerative part of our rotation. Next slide, please. I would say that in the arable East, we've been burning our carbon coffers built by generations of mixed farmers before us. And arguably, our carbon bank is about to go into the red. Now, this is just being debunked in the Farmers Weekly this week. I can't remember who did it, but there was a quote about we've only got 60 harvests left. But if we have only got 60 harvests left, then this is why. And this is a photograph of a field, not my field, I hasten to add, which is next door to a bit of permanent pasture, so exactly the same soil type. The permanent pasture, deep, rich, full of organic matter and bursting with life. And this field here, right next door, overworked and in a terrible state. And some serious remediation work needs to be done for that field if it's even going to last for 60 harvests. Next slide, please. But can we do it without animals? Well, possibly, but animals are a crop. They provide an alternative income source, and they also diversify our business. Not only do the lays build soil fertility, but they also improve soil health by diversifying the soil biome. Next slide, please. So if we're not willing or we're not able to have animals, we still have to find ways of increasing soil organic matter. And my feeling is that we're very limited organically about what we can bring in. But one of the things we can bring in is this compost from green waste. But as far as I'm concerned, there's too much plastic in it. We have to do something about that. We're not allowed to use biodigestate, but the problems with things like antibiotics and estrogen in biodigestate, I think, has to be addressed, and that would be one of my questions to Anglian Water. But can we increase soil organic matter and soil health just through the use of intercrop green manures without animals on the farm? And these are the big questions that we need to be asking ourselves. Can I have the next slide, please? So being organic means that we don't use herbicides. And so our main focus has to rely on mechanics, which obviously has an effect on soil health. But in my view, it's about a balance. It's about a balance of looking at releasing soil nutrients, but also managing soil organic matter. And so we very much take a managed approach when thinking about cultivations. And this is done on a field by field basis. And we make those decisions appropriate to the soil conditions. But also we consider about the field's place in the rotation, the requirements for the crop, the weed pressure, the type of cultivation appropriate for any dominant weed in that field. And I would also say that in the absence of herbicides, and especially glyphosate, to rely on a single cultivation or drilling type is risky as you start to select weed problems. I believe that appropriate cultivations in the exploitative part of our rotation, which is the cropping part of our rotation, when balanced with the regenerative part, which is the 2 to 3 year grazing lays that we have, are not detrimental to soil health when managed appropriately. But I think they actually promote it. So next slide, please. So can we, reduce our cultivations, because ultimately they do have an impact on soil health. And over the next few years, we're going to try and reduce them by half, which will mean that we will need less machinery, save on fuel, and reduce the amount of nitrous oxide we release from the soil. So this is a picture of our living mulch trial, and you can see that there's 2 varieties of low-growing clover that have been planted in between the rows of the crop, which you can see by the stubble, which remains after harvest. And the idea is we're going to strip till in between those rows of clover, leaving that clover in the field permanently as a living mulch, and then just drill back into the same place where the stubble is year on year. This will not only reduce our emissions, but will also sequester more carbon by having a living plant continuously in the soil at the same time as growing crops. And also, obviously, the clover is a great habitat for pollinators as well. Can I have the next slide, please? No-till is seen by many farmers as a panacea to managing soil health, but is currently dependent on chemistry for its success. So, what are organic farmers trying to do to sort of combat, being able to do no-till and suppress weeds by this carpet of mulch on the top of the field? And so this is Ben Colchester set up, who farms on the west coast of Ireland, and he's got a Rodale crimp on the front, followed by a weaving drill. And you can see a picture of him driving through a crop of triticale vetch, crimping it at anthesis, and then underneath that you can see a crop of a picture of the crop coming up. But there's other people doing great work as far as this is concerned. James Alexander, who from Prime West, who's an organic farmer but also a non-organic farmer, and Andrew Wolf, who's a farmer in Oxfordshire. So people are looking at solutions about no-till without glyphosate. Can I put the next slide, please? So management of profitable soils increasingly means for us growing more than one crop in the field. And there's many reasons to plant more than one species in the field. So one, to lessen the spread of disease. It disrupts insects attacking crops as well as building beneficials, to smother weeds, but also to build soil health. And a diversity in plant species means that less or no pesticides are used, which can damage soil life. And if the mixture contains legumes or where plants remain living within a senescing crop, the soil continues to be fed and can enable farmers to use less or no artificial fertilizer, which are also known to have an effect on soil health. And also having different crops in the field gives different rooting profiles to help structure the soil, as well as bring major and micronutrients up into the rooting zone. Can I have the next slide, please? So we also use controlled traffic farming to increase soil health and profitability. And I'm sure there's many of you who are doing it out there, but essentially it's best described as the precise targeting of farm traffic, leaving the non-trafficked area as undisturbed beds. And we work on 8.8 metre lanes with the majority of our machinery, but primary cultivations are 4.4 metres. And we haven't used the plough to break our lathes for several years. I think if you press, you can see this tractor working. You press next slide. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? The next slide is a picture of some fine tuning that we have to do in that the combine, you can see the tractor, the combine's designed, the spout, to drop the corn, the wheat straight into the middle of the trailer, but there's some fine tuning to do on sort of wheel width. So we need to put the wheel width of our tractor out to run into where the combine goes. So next slide, please. So the second question is, how does this affect this farming approach affect nature on our farm? So next slide. For a number of years, we have worked with the Suffolk Wildlife Trust to quantify the changes our way of farming impacts wildlife. Next slide. So we only have one set of comparative data at present, which was between us and a similar proximate farm. We'd just taken on this farm contracted on a contract farming arrangement, and it was surveyed at that point to compare ours, having farmed organically at that point for 15 years. And you'll see here that our breeding bird territories, another Suffolk farm is the other farm, were 43 and we were 132. And amber and red winter bird territories, the farm we took on was 25 and we had 612. And the conclusion was, as noted in the breeding bird survey, since the two farms are broadly similar in terms of their position in the Suffolk landscape, it is difficult to escape the conclusion that the highly significant differences in wintering bird populations reflects the effects of the contrasting management regimes. So can I have the next slide, please? So since then, we have done a butterfly survey, of which we recorded 23 different species, and most of those were seen as previously being declining species. Next slide, please. 2017, we had a botanical survey, and this included hundreds of species, but these were some of note. Next slide, please. A dragonfly survey. We have 15 species found, which was deemed to be relatively interesting because we have very few, we don't have any real sort of water sources, rivers on the farm, just farm ponds. Next slide, please. And also pond surveys as well. Next slide. And finally, bees and wasp survey. I think what's interesting about this slide is that you'll see that we've got the fringeless nomad bee, which was the first one that has been found in East Anglia. But it's my opinion that, you know, they're probably actually all over the place. But as farmers, we're very bad at going out there and finding out what we've got on our farms. And I think it's absolutely key, because surveys don't only inform us of what we've got, but it bolsters our argument about environmental delivery, which is essential at a time when so much is going to be expected of us environmentally in the future. Can I have the next slide, please? So how are we making climate friendly decisions? And this is my last question. Next slide. Well, I would argue that we've been making climate friendly decisions since our organic conversion in 1999, but to understand and go, you know, Becky's covered this, but to understand where we are now, it's important to undertake a carbon report. And we did ours in 2015 with the Farm Carbon Toolkit. And for an exercise, I didn't actually do it on the platform, but I used the original spreadsheet that in those days we were supplied with by the Farm Carbon Toolkit, and updated it because we understood better about the soil organic matter we'd been building, but also we'd increase the number of livestock on the farm. So that had to be taken into account. So if I just go through where we were and where we are now with that updated information, the next slide, please. So where were our emission sources? Next slide. So unsurprisingly, tractors, harvesting and farm vehicles made up 35% of our emissions. However, our 50 kilowatt solar panels offset 10 tonnes of CO2. Next slide. Nitrous oxide from crops, leguminous leys, green manures and some brought in rock phosphate emitted 49%. However, it's important to understand that grass and clover leys and green manures can substantially increase soil organic matter, which sequesters atmospheric carbon. Next slide, please. Building materials use on the farm, including wood, metal, water, paper and tyres, amounted to a mere 0.1% of total emissions. Next slide, please. And there's a lot of embodied energy in steel, and the impact of brought in new farm machinery is taken into account. But if you account for these emissions in 1 year, they would contribute 37% of total emissions. But depreciated over 10 years, their useful lifetime on our farm, new machinery contributed 3.7% of total emissions. Next slide, please. And of course, livestock contributed to 12.4% of emissions. Next slide, please. This figure actually probably does need adjusting, and I didn't adjust it because we've got some of our organic oats going over to Northern Ireland. But at the time, transport to local mills accounted for 1.3% of emissions, and which was surprising actually if you think that actually we probably like to attribute more to food miles, but in this case it was only 1.3% of emissions. Next slide, please. So that's what we are emitting. So what are we sequestering? Next slide. So 4.5% of our carbon was sequestered in farm woodlands. It wasn't surprising because we've only got one wood on the farm of about 11 hectares, and the rest are really small copses around the edges and in the corners of fields. Next slide. 2.8% of our sequestered carbon was in our permanent field margins and our hedges. Next slide, please. However, the staggering figure is that since converting to organic production over 20 years ago, and with the reintroduction of livestock in 2014, and having built natural fertility in our soils with the use of fertility lays and green manures, we have more than doubled our soil organic matter from 2.9% in 1999 to an average of 5.5% today. And you know, this is quite an incredible figure, but I also accept that we probably started from quite a low base. And so, you know, we have to understand that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we plan to do in the future. But can we just have the next slide for the sort of final figures? So the final figures turn out that we have a total carbon balance of sequestering 5,105 tons of CO2e, which means that we are a carbon sink and not a carbon emitter. Next slide, please. But there's always room for improvement, as I said before, and we could be doing better in terms of fuel, less cultivations releasing nitrous oxide, and less machinery. Next slide, please. So back to our living mulch. Cropping at the same time as sequestering carbon 12 months a year, every year, and only cultivating half the farm. I think if it works, I think it's going to be a really exciting new direction for us, and also potentially sort of turning the traditional rotation on its head. Next slide, please. And then finally, agroforestry. Growing trees, essentially it's growing trees in lines while growing crops in between those alleys of trees. So growing an annual crop alongside a perennial crop. And I don't know if any of you on the call went to see the wonderful Martin Wolf, who farmed at Wakelands near Fressingfield, but this was Martin standing in his 12-metre alleys. Even Martin, actually, unfortunately, he died last year, but we had a long chat about it, and he agreed with me that possibly, you know, the alleys were too narrow, but of course they are a crop, and so when they've reached maturity, one of those alleys could come out and turns it into a 24-metre alley. Next slide, please. So we took the plunge, having taken about 20 years sort of dithering whether we should or we shouldn't do it, and we started planting our first 50 acres this year. And this is a picture of us in lockdown over Christmas, where everybody disappeared because one of my daughters went down with COVID and had to bribe my children to go out and help me plant trees. So this is two of my kids planting trees. It was very cold, but they did incredibly well. Next slide, please. So rather than Martin's being at 12 metres, we've got a alley system. You can see the three fields that we planted on 36 metres. They're actually 40-metre centres because the alleys of trees are planted in 4.5-metre wildlife seed mixtures. And so there's going to be a nice early source of pollen for pollinators, and then eventually these trees will get to maturity. And the reason why we planted them at 36 metres is because by the time they get to maturity, they will still just start shading the crop and reducing yield. But then, of course, when they reach maturity, they're a crop in themselves, and they will be harvested and then replanted. And so, you know, through the use of lays and sustainable rotations, we are already a carbon sink, improving our soils to make them continuously profitable and increasing wildlife across the farm. With the help of a developing agroforestry system and using our living mulch, we hope that we will continue to be a carbon sink into the future while growing crops, rearing livestock, protecting wildlife, and farming profitably. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And what a journey it has been since 1999. We have some questions for you, John. This one from James Black. Many of us have been adding organic matter to soils for many years. There is a disparity in the legislation on what level can be applied as farmyard manure versus via grazing stock. Is this sensible, and could you comment?
Well, I know that James obviously has been applying a huge amount of organic manure to his farm from his livestock system for many, many years. And it's difficult for me to answer the question because I'm not a scientist. And what I would say is that different soils have the different abilities to hold the kind of organic manure that he is spreading and that we would wish to spread. I think that, you know, I can't stress more, as far as I'm concerned, the importance of organic manures. And there's trial after trial showing you that, regular applications of organic manure do huge amounts of the soil, but also the long-term profitable yields of organic crops and non-organic crops, but also building, protein into milling wheat, those kind of things. I had this fantastic conversation with a miller who said, they have a real problem with diminishing amounts of protein in milling wheat. And when asked what will he put it down to, he said, well, we've just been burning all this carbon. We used to get much better milling quality wheat, and we're just using all the carbon up in our soil. So I'm a big advocate of using organic manures in our soils.
Thank you, John. There's a question emanating from your introduction of sheep, which is from Giles Cooper. He said, are you concerned about the effects on the wider red meat sector if lots of arable farmers start to integrate sheep and cattle back onto their farms?
It's a really good question. I'm afraid I come from the camp of eating less meat and eating better meat. And so, and I think that more and more people are beginning to think that that is a good thing, based on all the, climate change reasons that we know about, but also animal welfare reasons. And, I would very much like to see it going in the direction of more animals outside, effectively less of them, because the more intensively reared animals probably might lose market share. And so I don't have any worries about it at all. I mean, we very much market them from coming from Shimpling Park Farm and telling the story and engaging with our customers. So I don't feel and I don't want to compete with the mass meat market.
Okay, thank you. A question from here in Norfolk, from Neil Punchard. Many Norfolk farm businesses are reliant on potatoes as a cash crop. What do you view the likelihood of growing organic potatoes and maintaining a reasonable financial return relative to the risk?
Well, I'm not a potato grower, so what sort of direction does that question come from? Sorry.
I think it's probably looking at trying to cross over the experience and the skills of organic production from the combinable crop, say, into the root sector, be it potatoes or sugar beet.
We used to grow sugar beet. I think, managing soil organic matter and growing root crops, can be a challenge. But I think, integrated in the right rotation. I mean, when I first converted, one of the sort of, the rotations that was sort of promoted organically was, having potatoes very near to the beginning after a fertility building lay. And, potatoes are a fantastic crop to grow organically because you've got the ridging to deal with weeds right up until the sort of, the canopy sort of closes over. So I think in the right rotation, then those root crops really have a place. And I come back to what I was trying to get across, and hopefully I did, is that I don't think we should be worried about cultivations. If we're building soil organic matter in rotations that contain animals and lays, and we're adding farmyard manure to our rotations, I don't think we should be scared about cultivating. I think we have to release those natural nutrients, but it's done in a sustainable, longer rotation. And I think that, that's absolutely fine.
Thank you. A question from William Cubitt. At what stage do you drill clover into your cereal crop or stubble?
So on our own farm, and this will, be different across different soil types, we find it the best time to establish our clover is under sowing it in either spring wheat or spring barley. It seems to like a nurse crop. It's always done better for us as far as that establishment is concerned. We tried drilling it after harvest, but generally, you have to get that clover plant to a reasonable size before it gets its first frost. And so I prefer to put it into warming soils rather than soils that potentially are getting colder.
Thank you. And finally, the last question directly to you, John, is one from Elizabeth Ranelagh at FWAG. What sort of trees are you using in your agroforestry, please?
Okay, so we are tipping a nod to Alpheton wood, which is a triple SI. And so we are really planting all the trees that we find in a sort of heavy land triple SI, apart from ash. And the concept is to not only pull species out of the wood, but also drag species back into the wood. One of the things that we are missing from our ancient woodland is dormice, and I believe that sort of planting these alleys across the farm, if they're in the local area, gives them a better chance to get up to elf-eaten wood. So that's the idea.
Thank you very much, John. We'll now move into the final point of the morning, which is to bring Becky back to join John for a final question and answer session. There is another one here, John, about the orientation of your tree belts. Are they running north-south or in any particular direction?
That's a really good question. This is just the farmer getting the better of me and they were all going to be going in north-south direction, but actually 2 of the fields go slightly off a north-south direction because there was a straight hedge, and I just couldn't resist the temptation of planting along the straightest line. So it's almost one of them is absolutely north-south, and 2 of them are not quite. But my feeling is that we've got to think of things in the round. It's going to make the fields more productive as we planted them, but as the trees get to full maturity, there might be a little bit more compromise in those 2 fields.
Okay, and that was a question from William Notcutt. There's a question here for both John and Becky. Have you considered deeper measurement of soil organic matter, perhaps up to 60 centimetres soil sampling? With deep rooting covers, this is a potential long-term CO2 trading option, and that's from Tom Pearson.
Do you want to go first, John, and then I can, in terms of what you're doing, and then I can back that up with what we're doing in Soil Carbon Project, if you like.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yes, I'm very happy to. I think it's a very good idea, and I think if we're getting those fantastic rooting depths and some of those green manures that we plant because they've got these fantastic deep rooting systems. Yes, why wouldn't you want to know what that's doing? I mean, the problem we have, and I freely admit this, is that our results on a soil loss and ignition test, which is not a great test, but it's what we've used for a very long time, and that's what we're going with. But I think it's a complex situation, and I think Becky will be able to answer this a lot better than I can.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point, and understanding what's going on with depth is a key part of any analysis that you're going to do. So when you're going to test soils for their organic carbon or organic matter percentage or content, it's really important that you're consistent at the depth that you take the samples to. What we've been doing within the Soil Carbon Project is we've actually been splitting out depth. So we've been taking samples at 0 to 10 centimetres, 10 to 30 centimetres, and then 30 to 50 centimetres. So we haven't been going down to 60 centimetres as the question was, but we've certainly been understanding what's been going on at 30 to 50 centimetres. And what we're starting to see, which is really, really interesting, and it sort of goes back into the discussions that often had around carbon saturation and all those other sort of things, is that actually by splitting out those 3 depths, we can start to sort of track that transition from more active cycling carbon that's going on in the very close to the surface down to more long-term stable carbon as you go down the soil profile. And certainly for those farmers that are starting to implement more deeper rooting species, either through their grasslands or also within their cover crops, understanding how much of that carbon is being put further down the soil profile where it's less likely to be released is really, really important. And what we can also then do when we start looking at carbon calculations is, because when you add in your measurements, you can take account of the depth of sampling. If you then know what's going on further down the soil profile, you can then add that in as an additional sequestration. So John's fantastic results that he's got so far that have been very much focusing on what's been, I don't know what depth you've been sampling to, John, sort of 20 centimetres there. How far have you been sampling so far?
Yeah, about 20 centimetres.
So you can put in your 20 centimetres, and then every now and again, it's a little bit like sort of manure analysis. It doesn't change massively often. So every now and again, doing a deeper carbon sample and understanding what's going on further down, you can actually then add that sequestration on top. So you can put in what's going on to 20 centimetres and then look at what's going on further down. And that provides an additional benefit, both in terms of carbon footprinting, but also in terms of that transition to more long-term stable carbon.
Okay, thanks for that. Here's one for Becky from Michael Payne. Do you know whether government will be doing anything to incentivise farm actions to reduce carbon emissions? And if so, what will the measures be?
I think what we know, although I freely admit I don't have a crystal ball, so what DEFRA are going to do is slightly beyond, I'm not good at predicting the future, but certainly we know that within the sort of broad types of farming, so for different sorts of livestock farming and for arable farming, we know what those main areas are which are producing emissions. And we know what those things are which are good at producing sequestration. So for arable farmers, again, we know that as John highlighted through his talk, we know that for non-organic farmers, fertilizer, specifically nitrogen fertilizer, is a huge part of your emissions. Usually accounts on a conventional farm for about 60% of emissions for an arable farm. We also know that there's opportunities with cultivation. We know there's opportunities with fuel efficiency, and then we know there's other bits and pieces there as well. So you don't have to be Miss Marple to understand that those are where they're going to be focusing future incentives, compliance, all those sort of things. Now, what the format is in terms of how they're going to support those practices or regulate those practices, I don't know. But on an arable farm, certainly nitrogen use efficiency, looking at fuel use efficiency will be the ones that they will, and cultivation frequency they will look at. On a livestock farm, obviously, as John said, and as one of the questions came up earlier, looking at improved efficiency of livestock production systems is key, a part of it. Looking at percentage of diet that's coming from forage, looking at soil management, all of those things will be key. But again, how it's actually going to be incentivised, we don't know. Certainly there was talk early on of having a farm emissions reductions plan, which was originally called a FERP, that was going to take account of some of those practices. Now, I do hope they come up with a better name for it, but certainly, how you prioritise what to do is something that we don't quite know the details for yet. But for an individual farmer doing your carbon footprint, there will be lots of things that you can do which don't cost any money and will reduce your footprint. On 98% of the farms that we work with, we can take 10% off their carbon footprint using very easily done options which don't cost any money. So focus on those first before looking at some of those long-term things which might have a cost, or need a bit more understanding.
Thank you, Becky. That lots of small actions can add up to quite an outcome. This is a question specifically for John, and it's from Doug Shulman. John, really interesting presentation, thank you. Switching to organic, have you seen much of an reduction in your production costs and resultant gross margins? I suppose this is the proof of the pudding question. John, over to you.
I would argue that we have remained in most years over the 20 years we've been organic more profitable than if we weren't organic. It's a very different gross margin if you think about it, because we have no inputs apart from seed. As far as machinery is concerned, we just benchmarked ourselves against the groundswell sort of no tillers, and we do come out with a higher labor cost and higher machinery costs, but at the end of the day our net margin is still higher. So we went into organic farming because as a diversification project in 1999. We just weren't making any money out of conventional farming with wheat at £79 a tonne and oilseed rape at £115 a tonne. It was a diversification exercise, but I feel that we've done financially better out of it and done better as time goes on. But that's about getting better at what we do, and also about developing relationships with people buying our crops. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's about being farming profitably ultimately, and then all the wildlife, and sequestering carbon benefits have come along with that, which have been a fantastic plus.
Thank you. A question for both of you with regards to carbon emissions, I mean, in particular greenhouse gases. Do you think the debate would be better informed if we looked at emissions, particularly agricultural ones, and the livestock methane is the case in point. If we move to a system where we moved from the amount produced, i.e. the emission, and actually measured impact on the warming effect. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The case in point has been with methane, which obviously is having, behaves slightly differently as a greenhouse gas in the fact that it's a short-lived climate pollutant rather than a long-lived climate pollutant. I think rather than thinking about looking at the impact on global temperature rise, what I do think that we may end up transitioning to a system of is that we may end up where we're looking at biogenic emissions. So, for example, the emissions that are coming from animals themselves, the emissions that are coming from, natural carbon and nitrogen cycles, and then fossil fuel derived emissions, because I think that will allow us to have a slightly more nuanced discussion and compare ourselves on a more like for like footing with other sectors. I think at the moment, obviously, we are, if you were, something to sort of think about is if you were to take off all agricultural activity off our landscapes, they would still produce emissions as part of the carbon and nitrogen cycles. So we are in some ways unfairly penalised for those. Whereas if you were to split it out in terms of biogenic emissions and fossil fuels derived emissions, you would then have a better understanding of our contribution when you stick it in a pie chart and compare it with everybody else. But I do think, as hopefully one of the benefits of this increasing attention on our industry and our emissions is that we can start to have these more nuanced discussions, because if you go back 5 years, nobody really gave a toss about it. So nobody was paying any attention to it. Whereas now, one of the positives should hopefully be that actually we can start to say, well, some of the statistics and some of the ways that we do it are wrong and we need to change those, or not wrong, but we could do it in a better way. So hopefully that might be one of the unintended consequences. So rather than doing it in terms of impact on global warming, global temperature rise, maybe if we were just to separate out biogenic and fossil fuels, I think would be a good next step.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have nothing more to add. It was a great answer.
Thank you for that. I'm going to bit of a curved ball question that's coming to finish, and it's from Giles Cooper. What one publication would you suggest every farmer should read if they want to understand regenerative agriculture?
Okay, I'm going to go first to that. There isn't one publication. The great thing that we have today is I have a very positive experience for social media. We've got lots of fantastic farmers, not just in the UK, you can talk to on places like Twitter, in the UK, in the USA, all over the world. YouTube absolutely packed with information out there. There is no one publication, and that's what's so wonderful. And it's all at our fingertips, or at the end, at the end of our screen.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The only one book that a lot of the farmers that we deal with have said has been their sort of introduction to it and is written in quite a digestible way is Dirt to Soil. It's one that comes up time and time again, which is by Gabe Brown. It is written in a really nicely digestible form. Some of them are quite hard going, but that one is a nice introduction to the whole area and the 5 pillars of soil health and all those sort of things. But John's absolutely right. We are so lucky at the moment that we can, through a click of a mouse, we can access expertise from all over the place. And the whole idea of us all being shut down because of the global pandemic suddenly means that all these experts from all through all the new advances in technology, we can access them. So just go and have a look at it. But that's a good book to start off with.
Thank you, Becky. You get the prize because that's the publication that the person who put the question to you has just finished reading. I would now like to bring matters to a close for the morning, and just to say thank you to John and Becky for the final question and answer session, and for their enthusiastic presentations and how well they've dealt with the questions. If I was going to summarise today's conference, I was sitting comparing my summary at similar farm business updates last year, where we're focusing on the level of change that stood before us, that DEFRA had proposed in their policy papers. As we stand today, I think we're further along that journey and understanding the direction of travel, and it's slowly evolving. There'll be a lot more to develop in the coming year or so. And the common theme I've picked up from this morning is the pace of change and the detail. It's imperative that we all remain engaged and participate where possible. We take, for example, the ELMS journey. Where we are now is we're well into the test and trials and heading towards the pilot for future ELMS. DEFRA have stated they cannot do this by themselves. They need the industry to co-design this whole transition. So I would ask that you become as engaged as possible with test and trials and pilots, whether it's simply a questionnaire, attended meetings, but feed into it. It has two benefits. I think collectively, the input from many farmers and stakeholders will help to shape the future. Individually, it will give you first-hand knowledge and information ahead of the curve to inform your decisions to take your business forward. And finally, I'd like to make some thank yous. I'd like to thank all the contributing organisations whose logos have been on the screen this morning, and especially their representatives who form the Farm Business Update Steering Group, who deliver this event every year. They will be sending out an online survey, and I ask you to please fill it in and return it, because it helps to shape future events. I'd particularly like to thank the water companies for their generous support of the audio-visual facility this morning. And a note of thanks to Marcus Lauday and his team at Hawk Audio Visual, who've made everything possible today. Many thanks to our speakers for their stimulating and informative presentations. Thank you for giving so much of your time and expertise. And finally, a thank you to you, our attendees, for taking part today, for attending and for your questions. There are 330 people online participating today, and I've been massively impressed with the number of questions. Thank you for that, and apologies if your question hasn't been asked. But I will ask the steering group to aggregate the questions, and in the presentation survey post out, I will ask them to address some of those points, if possible, within that process. It finally leaves me to say that these have been exceptional times, and we went from having no farm business updates this year to the provision of this virtual online conference. Thank you to everyone for attending and participating, and have a successful 2021 farming year. Thank you and goodbye.